You probably heard of the Victorians, the fancy dresses, the top hats, the elegant manners, and the iconic imagery of their society. But do you really know what life was like for them behind all that polished grandeur? If you think the Victorian era was all about fine tea parties and beautiful gowns, get ready to be shocked. Today, we're going to expose some of the most filthy and disturbing secrets about Victorian hygiene. From stinking streets to a complete lack of basic sanitation, the Victorians were living in a world that seems almost unbelievable today. There was no daily shower, no toothpaste, and let's not even get started on what they did with their waste. It's hard to imagine how people survived, but the truth is, hygiene in Victorian times was way worse than you might think. Stick around, because we're about to dive into the grimy details of the past, Victorian hygiene at its worst. I promise you, by the end of this video, you'll be looking at your own modern conveniences like hot water, soap, and indoor plumbing with a whole new level of appreciation. Now, you might think you know a lot about history, but you probably never heard about the horrific hygiene habits of the Victorian era. It's easy to picture the Victorian period as a time of elegance and charm, but once you dig deeper, it's clear that the reality was far more grim. What might surprise you most is how people's everyday habits and the lack of basic hygiene were directly linked to the spread of disease, and just how far they were willing to go, or avoid going, to keep clean. In this video, we're going to look at how people lived in a world with no daily baths, no toothpaste, and no functioning toilets. The truth is darker than you think. Stick with us, and by the end, you'll understand why the Victorians had a very different view on hygiene compared to what we consider normal today. The lack of bathing facilities, a dirty routine. Let's start with the most basic act of personal care, bathing. Today, we jump into a shower every day or maybe every other day, and we can't imagine living any other way. But the Victorians didn't have that luxury. In fact, most people didn't bathe regularly, and it wasn't seen as something necessary for health or cleanliness. Imagine living in a world where you didn't shower every day, and it wasn't because of lack of time, but because people didn't know any better. During the Victorian era, bathing was actually a rare event. Public baths did exist, but these were often overcrowded, poorly maintained, and unsafe. Imagine sharing water with dozens of strangers. These public baths were often breeding grounds for diseases because the water was used over and over again, making it very unhygienic. Even for the wealthy who had access to private baths in their homes, it wasn't something they did often. In fact, many Victorian homes didn't even have bathtubs. If you wanted to clean up, you'd have to fill a basin with water, and usually that would just be for washing your face and hands. And for the poor, a bath was something reserved for the very rare occasion, perhaps only once or twice a year. Instead, they might use sponges or rags to clean up, but only when absolutely necessary. To make matters worse, people often believed that too much water was actually harmful to your health. The Victorians thought that bathing too frequently could lead to skin problems, illness, or even death. So they avoided it as much as possible. People often only washed their faces and hands, or sponged off using a cloth. This was far from the hygienic standards we have today, and it left people walking around in the same dirty clothes, with oily skin and unwashed bodies for weeks at a time. No toilets, just chamber pots and cesspools. If you thought bathing was bad, let's take a closer look at how the Victorians dealt with their bodily functions. Back then, the idea of a toilet was still a luxury for the wealthy. For the majority of people, there was no indoor plumbing and no flush toilets. Instead, the common practice was the use of chamber pots, small, portable containers used as makeshift toilets in the bedroom. Chamber pots were used during the night, and the waste would be dumped outside in the morning, often into the streets. This wasn't just unsanitary, it was a health hazard. In some of the poorer neighborhoods, chamber pots would overflow, and the streets would become covered in human waste, animal dung, and garbage. Imagine living in a city where the streets were literally covered in filth and human waste, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. The more fortunate Victorians might have access to a privy, a small outhouse outside their home, but even that was far from clean. Waste would often pile up in cesspools, which were open pits where human waste was thrown. These cesspools were rarely emptied, and because they weren't sealed, the waste would leak into the environment, adding to the already unpleasant living conditions. And if you lived in a big city like London, you can imagine the smell. It must have been overwhelming. But this wasn't just a matter of bad hygiene. It was a matter of life and death. Without proper sewage systems, diseases like cholera and typhoid spread quickly, and entire neighborhoods could be wiped out by illness. Without modern knowledge of germs and disease transmission, people had no idea how dangerous their unsanitary practices were. Dental hygiene, a painful and unhealthy practice. Let's talk about teeth. Today, brushing your teeth is something we do every single day, without fail. It's part of our basic routine. But back in the Victorian era, people didn't think much about brushing their teeth. In fact, brushing your teeth was an unheard of practice for most of society. If you had any sort of dental hygiene routine, you were in the minority. People who were fortunate enough to have teeth probably didn't keep them for long. That's because Victorians had no concept of cavities, gum disease, or tooth decay the way we do today. Toothbrushes were primitive, and toothpaste, if it existed at all, was made from things like chalk, charcoal, or even brick dust. These substances were far too harsh on the enamel of your teeth and did little to clean or protect them. Most people simply didn't worry about their teeth. After all, they didn't have the kind of medical knowledge we have today about how poor dental care can lead to infections and other serious health issues. If you had a toothache, your best bet was to have the tooth pulled out. If you lost a tooth, you either lived with it or replaced it with a denture, usually made from wood, or even human teeth pulled from cadavers. Yes, you heard that right. Some wealthy Victorians would even purchase fancy false teeth made from ivory or gold, while the poorer classes had to settle for crude wooden or metal dentures. The dirty clothes dilemma, laundry was a chore. Now, imagine wearing the same clothes day in and day out without the ability to clean them. For the Victorians, washing clothes was no easy task. Today, we simply toss our clothes into a washing machine and they come out clean and fresh. But back then, washing clothes was a labor-intensive job that could take hours, if not days. Soap wasn't as effective as it is now, and washing machines weren't even invented yet. The poor had it especially rough. Without access to laundry services or even enough water, washing clothes was often a luxury. Instead of getting clean clothes, they just wore what they had until it was completely worn out. For the wealthy, clothes were typically washed by hand, but even then, washing was infrequent and didn't get rid of all the dirt. Clothes would often get stained, and people didn't have modern detergents or fabrics that could resist dirt as effectively as ours do today. As you can imagine, with all the filth in the streets, the stench of unwashed clothes, bodies, and waste, Victorian cities must have been unbearable at times. There was no fresh, clean air to be had in many urban areas, and the smell of human waste and decay hung in the air like a heavy fog. This was the reality of life for the Victorians, and it led to a wide range of health problems, from skin diseases to respiratory issues caused by the polluted air, unpleasant living conditions, disease, and overcrowding. Living conditions in Victorian cities were often overcrowded, filthy, and dangerous. Poor families typically lived in cramped spaces, sometimes sharing a room with several other families. With little to no proper sanitation, these conditions were a breeding ground for disease. The lack of proper waste disposal, coupled with overcrowding, meant that disease could spread rapidly. Cholera, typhoid fever, and tuberculosis were common, and these diseases claimed thousands of lives each year. Imagine being a child in one of these cramped homes, surrounded by filth, breathing in polluted air, and eating food that was often contaminated. It's no wonder that many people didn't live long enough to see old age. Health impacts, a legacy of sickness. The combination of bad hygiene, overcrowding, and lack of medical knowledge led to widespread illness and death. Poor hygiene was directly responsible for the spread of deadly diseases. And without vaccines or modern medicine, people had very few ways to protect themselves. This is why so many people, particularly the poor, lived in constant fear of disease. Victorians didn't know about germs or how diseases spread through unclean water or unsanitary living conditions. But we do today, and that's why we take hygiene so seriously. The dirty conditions that many Victorians lived in were directly linked to the suffering and death they faced during their lifetimes. Many lives were cut short because of poor sanitation and hygiene, And it wasn't until later in the 19th century that public health reform started to make a real difference. The lack of bathing facilities, an everyday struggle. As we already discussed, bathing in the Victorian era was not something that was done regularly. However, the reasons for this lack of cleanliness weren't simply due to ignorance. They were deeply ingrained in social attitudes and a misunderstanding of hygiene. For the wealthy, access to water was not a problem. They often had large estates and a regular supply of fresh water, but many still didn't see the need for frequent bathing. The idea of cleanliness being next to godliness was not yet fully widespread. Instead, there was a cultural notion that excessive bathing could weaken the body, making one more susceptible to disease. This was especially true among the upper classes who had access to more luxurious living conditions, where cleanliness was associated with a more superficial type of health. The wealthy class might bathe more regularly than the poor, but not necessarily every day. If they had the means, they would take a bath in a large tub of water, often in front of a fireplace to keep warm. However, these baths were seen as something that was done perhaps once a week, or even less frequently. To wash the body, people might simply use a damp cloth and wash the face, hands, and neck, areas considered to be more important to clean in a society obsessed with the appearance of upper-class beauty. Interestingly, this behavior was driven by a complex web of beliefs. At the time, it was thought that the body could absorb harmful vapors from water that could lead to sickness. This misguided understanding of hygiene meant that the Victorians avoided regular bathing, even though water itself was crucial for keeping diseases at bay. What was even more surprising is that, for the most part, there was no widespread public knowledge about how germs spread or how they could lead to illness. A person could be perfectly healthy outwardly, while in reality, they were carrying bacteria and pathogens that could spread to others. Despite this, water was often viewed as dangerous and dirty, leading to the strange attitude toward personal cleanliness that defied logic. Meanwhile, for the working class, the story was different. For those in poor urban areas, the concept of bathing was a luxury they couldn't afford. Many working-class families lived in overcrowded tenements, where space was limited and there was no room for something like a private bath. Instead, these families would rely on community bathhouses, which were often more accessible. These bathhouses, however, were overcrowded, grimy, and poorly maintained. The water was often reused, making it a prime environment for spreading infections and illnesses. Imagine stepping into a bath that had been used by dozens of other people, all in the same water. These bathhouses weren't places of relaxation. They were, at best, the bare minimum for hygiene. Public bathhouses were also places where you'd encounter other unclean habits. The water used for bathing was not always clean, and it became contaminated easily. They lacked modern plumbing and filtration systems, and the communal atmosphere didn't help in preventing the spread of germs. For many people, going to a bathhouse wasn't about enjoying a soak in warm water. It was more about doing the absolute minimum to ensure cleanliness. The horrific dangers of the unwashed body, disease and contagion, lack of personal hygiene and proper sanitation in the Victorian era contributed to the high rates of disease that plagued society. Without an understanding of bacteria, viruses, and the link between cleanliness and health, people often had no idea that their dirty living environments and lack of basic personal care were directly contributing to their illnesses. Cholera was one of the most devastating diseases during the Victorian period. It spread rapidly, particularly in densely populated urban centers like London. The disease was transmitted through contaminated water, but at the time, no one knew this. In fact, the Victorians believed that cholera was spread through bad air or miasma, a theory that held that disease came from poisonous vapors in the air. It wasn't until later in the 19th century, with the work of scientists like John Snow, that people began to understand the true cause of cholera. In these unsanitary conditions, cholera outbreaks were frequent and deadly. The disease was highly contagious, and it would spread through contaminated drinking water or improperly disposed waste. In some cases, entire neighborhoods were decimated by outbreaks. Victorians living in these conditions often died suddenly and violently, with symptoms including extreme diarrhea, vomiting, and dehydration, which would eventually lead to death in a matter of hours if untreated. The grim irony is that something as simple as clean water, something we take for granted today, could have saved countless lives during this time. Other diseases that were rampant during the Victorian era included tuberculosis, also known as consumption, which was spread by coughing and spitting. The crowded and unsanitary conditions in homes and public places like factories and workshops made it easy for airborne diseases to spread quickly. TB was a disease that plagued all social classes, but the poor, living in close quarters, were the most vulnerable. This made tuberculosis a silent killer in many Victorian cities, taking thousands of lives. Typhoid fever was another widespread illness. Like cholera, typhoid fever was caused by drinking contaminated water or eating food contaminated with human waste. In areas where waste was dumped into the streets or into open water sources, typhoid fever was a constant threat. The Victorians didn't have the luxury of modern sanitation, so the germs were left to spread in these vulnerable environments. People didn't just live in unclean conditions. They were often unaware of the dangers around them. The strange and dangerous hygiene practices of time. Even though the Victorians didn't have much knowledge about germs, they did have some strange and sometimes dangerous methods of attempting to stay clean. These practices were often based on misguided theories of health or cosmetic beauty, but the results were far from sanitary. One of the most bizarre trends among Victorian women was the use of toxic face powders to whiten their skin. Pale skin was seen as a symbol of wealth and beauty. So many women used face powders made from a variety of ingredients, some of which were incredibly harmful. Lead-based powders were particularly common. Lead, of course, is highly toxic, and prolonged exposure could cause severe poisoning, leading to neurological damage, organ failure, and death. For oral hygiene, the Victorians used some truly peculiar items. They didn't have toothpaste as we know it today, but they used powders made from substances like charcoal, chalk, and even burnt bread. These powders were abrasive, and they often did more harm than good, wearing down tooth enamel rather than cleaning effectively. As mentioned before, if Victorians had a dental issue, the solution was typically to have the tooth extracted, not treated. As for deodorants, well, they didn't exist. Instead, Victorians masked body odor with perfumes and scented powders, which did little to combat the actual issue of hygiene. Instead of getting rid of the sweat or bacteria that caused the smell, they simply added a stronger scent to cover it up. They were not interested in eradicating the root cause of the problem. They just wanted to smell better. People also used strange concoctions to clean themselves or to smell fresh. Some people used vinegar or even brandy to clean their skin or freshen their breath. While some of these might have offered temporary solutions, none of them were effective in the long run, and they certainly didn't prevent illness the way modern hygiene practices do today. The unpleasantness of laundry and clothing. You might think of washing clothes as a simple chore, but for the Victorians, it was a massive undertaking. Laundry required a lot of time, effort, and often manual labor. The poor didn't have the luxury of washing machines, so they had to wash clothes by hand, using buckets of water, soap, and a washboard. This took a tremendous amount of effort, and laundry could take an entire day to finish. For the wealthy, the situation wasn't much better. The process of washing and drying clothes was arduous. Clothing was often made from heavy fabrics that took forever to dry. Clothes would get stained easily, and there weren't any of the modern detergents we use today to remove stains. Clothes might not even get washed frequently, meaning they were often left dirty or stained for extended periods of time. In addition to this, clothing was expensive, especially for the middle and lower classes. People couldn't afford to buy a new outfit every time they needed one, so they wore the same clothes day after day. This often resulted in layers of dirt and grime building up on their clothing. The lack of modern laundry facilities, coupled with the need to preserve clothing for as long as possible, made hygiene much more challenging. For people living in the poor neighborhoods of Victorian cities, things like fresh clothes and clean linens were a luxury they couldn't always afford. It wasn't uncommon for poor families to live in homes with poorly ventilated rooms, damp conditions, and rats, adding to the overall discomfort and filth of their environment. These living conditions didn't just affect their hygiene, they also increased the risk of disease, as we've already discussed. As we reach the end of this exploration into the filthy and disturbing secrets of Victorian hygiene, it's hard not to feel a sense of gratitude for how far we've come. The conditions that Victorians lived under, despite their intellectual advancements in literature, science, and culture, were downright shocking when it came to personal care. It's easy to think of the Victorian period as an age of sophistication and elegance, but as we've seen, this image was far from the reality for many people. Behind the lace, the top hats, and the grand ballrooms was a society plagued by filthy streets, unsanitary living conditions, and harmful hygiene practices that affected everyone, regardless of class. The Victorian era was a time of both great progress and astonishing ignorance. They were on the verge of major discoveries, but when it came to health and hygiene, they had no idea how bacteria worked, how diseases spread, or even how something as simple as clean water could have saved lives. And while it's easy to point to the lack of understanding, it's also important to realize how culture, class, and even societal norms played a role in perpetuating unhealthy practices. When we think about how the Victorians lived, we have to remember that the lack of regular bathing wasn't simply due to laziness or neglect. Many believe that water, and especially frequent exposure to it, could be harmful to the body, and this misguided belief led to widespread poor hygiene practices. But even more fundamentally, the lack of proper sanitation systems meant that their cities were essentially breeding ground for disease. With no concept of germs or the invisible threats lurking in dirty water or unwashed hands, people didn't have the tools they needed to keep themselves safe. The result was a culture where disease could spread easily, and even the simplest illnesses could lead to death. Think about the ways the Victorians tried to manage their hygiene problems. Rather than acknowledging the root cause, lack of sanitation, and poor living conditions, they focused on masking symptoms with perfumes, powders, and scented sachets. This was a society obsessed with appearance, yet unwilling to address the messiness of life beneath the surface. What this shows us is that they weren't as ignorant as we might assume, but they were working within a framework of their time, influenced by ideas that now seem nonsensical. The idea of cleanliness as a marker of health was still in its infancy. This is hard to fathom when we live in a world where sanitation is taken for granted. Today, we have access to fresh water, advanced plumbing, and basic hygiene products like soap and toothpaste. Our understanding of the science of cleanliness has advanced significantly, and we now know that simple practices like washing hands and using toothpaste to brush teeth can drastically reduce the spread of disease. But the Victorians were stuck in a different reality, a reality where knowledge was still evolving, and everyday hygiene was at best neglected and at worst actively harmful. Let's not forget the role of class in all of this. The wealthier Victorians, though they had more access to sanitary products, often took the same approach to cleanliness as the poor. They didn't bathe frequently, as it was still considered bad for the body. The wealthy did have better living conditions, private baths, better access to clean water, but this didn't necessarily translate into healthier lifestyles. In fact, they were often more concerned with outward appearances than with actual hygiene. They spent fortunes on cosmetics and beauty treatments, but neglected the more basic aspect of health and cleanliness that we now consider essential. On the other hand, the poor in Victorian society had it even worse. Overcrowded living conditions in slums, combined with a lack of proper sanitation and health care, made it nearly impossible to maintain any form of basic hygiene. Many of them had to make do with shared public bathhouses, filthy streets, and overcrowded living spaces where diseases could easily spread. For these people, hygiene was not about self-care, it was about survival. Many were simply too busy trying to make ends meet to worry about the absence of regular baths or proper dental care. For them, hygiene wasn't a matter of preference. It was a luxury they couldn't afford. Perhaps one of the most sobering takeaways from our dive into Victorian hygiene is just how closely hygiene is tied to the overall health and well-being of society. Today, we take our modern plumbing, clean water, and dental care for granted, but these are things that many Victorians could not even imagine. The link between sanitation and public health was only recognized later in the 19th century, and it was a key factor in improving life expectancy and reducing mortality rates. When looking at the Victorians, we see a society grappling with modernity, full of contradictions. They were pioneers in so many fields: medicine, technology, literature, and social reform, but when it came to hygiene, they were a decade behind. They had the potential for better hygiene, but the practices were undermined by poor knowledge, limited resources, and cultural resistance to change. Today, We stand on their shoulders, but we also owe them a huge debt for the lessons we've learned about hygiene, disease control, and public health. The strides made in sanitation and hygiene in the 20th century are nothing short of remarkable. We can now prevent countless diseases that used to devastate societies. Today, we know the importance of hand washing, regular bathing, and brushing our teeth, not just for cosmetic reasons, but for our overall health. Thanks to scientific advancements, we now understand that germs, bacteria, and viruses play a huge role in our health, and that cleanliness isn't just about looking good. It's about staying alive. One important lesson we can take from the Victorians is the need for continuous education and progress. The Victorians didn't have the scientific knowledge we have today, but that doesn't mean they didn't make attempts to improve. They tried their best with what they had. We, too, should strive to constantly improve our understanding of hygiene and health and share that knowledge with others. But there's another valuable takeaway here. Context matters. As we judge the past from our modern perspective, it's important to recognize that the Victorians didn't know what we know now. We're fortunate to live in a time where so much is understood about disease, hygiene, and cleanliness, but that knowledge didn't come easily. It came from years of experimentation, trial and error, and the gradual development of scientific thought. The Victorians didn't have the luxury of this knowledge, and so they did the best they could with the tools and understanding available to them. So, the next time you step into a warm shower or brush your teeth with toothpaste, take a moment to appreciate the advancements that have been made, not just in hygiene, but in medicine, sanitation, and overall public health. It's easy to forget that these things weren't always a given. The clean water that flows from our taps, the toilets that flush away waste, and the basic hygiene products that we now take for granted are all relatively new in the grand scheme of human history. In conclusion, while the Victorian era certainly had its charm, it was also a period fraught with unsanitary practices and dangerous health risks. But it's important to remember that the Victorians helped lay the foundation for the modern world we now live in. Their failures and successes in hygiene were part of the evolution that led us to a cleaner, healthier, and longer life. Thank you for watching this deep dive into one of history's most fascinating and gross topics. I hope this video has given you a better understanding of just how far we've come when it comes to hygiene and health. If you enjoyed this journey through the filthy secrets of the past, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We've got more history to uncover, and I promise you, it's going to be just as eye-opening. If you enjoyed learning about the Victorian era and the shocking truth behind their hygiene practices, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Share your thoughts in the comments section below. Did anything in this video surprise you? What other historical periods would you like us to explore next? Let us know, and we'll see you in the next video.